one of the first things the Confederate States will do is they will move their capital to Richmond, Virginia. This will be an important decision because Richmond is not that far from D.C. And so to have these two capitals right there on the front lines of the war, very close to each other, is really going to shape how the war develops. If the capital would have been left in Birmingham, who knows how the Civil War would have been different. The Confederate States of America writes a constitution, and it mirrors the United States constitutions. But of course, it acknowledges the rights of the states. We're going to have a weaker federal government, stronger state governments in the South. And it acknowledges the right to slavery. Incidentally, it does not acknowledge the right to secede. Of course, it doesn't prohibit it either, it just doesn't mention it. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, who had been a moderate, actually, will become the president of the Confederate States of America. And Alexander Stephens, who had been against secession, will become the vice president of Georgia. And so it's interesting that these radicals who take the South out of the United States elect as their leaders much more moderate members. Davis, unlike Lincoln, respects the Confederate States Constitution. He is a stable leader and understands the limits of his authority. There are no parties in the South, but support for the war varies wildly. There is, of course, a cult of states' rights. Their argument, they don't talk much about slavery. What they talk about is the rights of the states to choose to do what they want. And of course, under this system, conscription is very hard, getting soldiers to join, because they don't believe the federal government should have that much power. State militias often refuse to cooperate with the Confederate Army, and this is a regular problem. The military, however, does exert some power. They draft food, they seize control of railroads, they will seize slaves, and a great irony, the Confederate States, arguing that the federal government can't take away your slaves, will take your slaves to help with the war effort. And they'll regulate industry, and they'll actually cap corporate profits. They'll say you can't make more than this percent on your money. And so they're interesting in that way. By the way, speaking of the cult of states' rights, there is a Confederate general whose name is States' Rights Gist. His parents named him States' Rights. You can look it up. Of course, financing is a huge problem. The states are asked to pay on a voluntary basis, and they don't want to. The state governments who led the South out of the Union don't want to pay for the war that it caused. In 1863, the Confederate States of America have to impose an income tax, but it's ineffective. For one thing, people don't really have income, they have property. The bonds they issued were worthless. Nobody was interested in loaning the money to the South. This included Europe. And so they really only had one choice. They just printed money. There was 9,000% inflation of the Confederate currency, which is crazy. In 1861, there are, of course, many volunteers. They're going to fight for the freedom of the South. But by April of 1862, those volunteers had dried up, and the South is going to be forced to turn to a draft. At first, you could hire a substitute just like you could in the North, but there just weren't enough, and so this was done away with quickly. By 1862, the Confederate Army had 500,000 soldiers in the Army. But by 1864, the Confederate Army is going to be on its way to defeat, specifically because they simply don't have enough boys. They don't have enough people to put out there. Now, this is a great irony, because if they would have, if the slaves would have been a viable option, they would have had, well, I don't know, plenty, but they would have had a whole lot more people and would have been a much more effective force. And by the end, the South is so desperate, they're considering arming the slaves, which I've suggested to you is the scariest thing in the world to a Southern man, is a black man with a gun. But that's how bad things are going to get. The war cuts the South off from its markets as well. It took away the non-slave labor force because they all had to go fight the war. And of course, they couldn't sell cotton to Europe for money. The North is going to blockade the South with the Anaconda Plan and prevent Southerners from shipping their cotton to Europe. In North, production increased dramatically, while in the South it dropped by a third. And of course, the fighting took place in the South, so the physical destruction of the South is important. The towns and the fields were literally destroyed. As women move into positions of power to replace men, the idea that women are inferior, remember women only have one right, and that is to be protected, it begins to be questioned. And of course, the loss of men leads to a generation, or maybe two generations, of single women. As many of a third to half of slaves are also freed by the war. And so the entire social order of the South is going to be completely turned on its head as a result of the Civil War.